Greetings, YouTubers. This might take a little while. Something I've had up since June. Pertaining to, this will be part two of Bill Maher and COVID-19, don't believe the hype. And I did that because Bill, see the links underneath the video. Bill, was this the recession you were hoping for? How about those piles of dead bodies up in the Northeast? Is that funny? I'm just wondering, is it funny? Because you said people will get hurt and you don't care. So is it funny, all those dead people in New York State? I'm just wondering, is it funny? I'll read all this off. This might take a while. David Marcus observes at the Federalist that despite polling in some areas to continue lockdowns, shelter in place, and other restrictions, those folks aren't taking their own advice. I should also note that lockdowns are not the same as social distancing, as one can engage in social distancing and not be locked down. I think some some progressives, are confused on this and conflating the terms. As I noted here, and you'll see the link there for among many items, you will need to refer to it for info on when various states engaged in lockdowns and to what degree. As I noted here, many states saw restaurant reservations plummet before virtually every governor, but not every governor, ordered some non-essential businesses shuttered aside from curbside services. We didn't even need a mandate for social distancing, as many private actors and citizens took actions themselves. The Imperial College model, proclaiming that 1.5 to 2.2 million deaths, and they did this to scare us. They did this to get their way. 1.5 million to 2.2 million deaths would occur from COVID-19 in the U.S. was so flawed, and one of the major flaws was the assumption that if there were no lockdowns, everyone would basically do nothing to mitigate spread of the virus. Many restaurants are taping off every other table. Barbers are taking folks' temperatures prior to entering. Walmart was monitoring the number of patrons in the store, keeping it below a certain amount. Dental offices, no offense, old fart rants, if you're listening, dental offices are taking your temperature. You don't have to worry about that one. Banks are only allowing folks inside with an appointment. Mine is. I haven't set foot inside my bank for a long time, but I don't really need to anyway. There are all kinds of mitigation techniques being implemented, sans Herr Governor or Herr Emperor issuing a diktat to the plebeians. That's retarded, to be blunt, but to folks who are so inept at life and history, they literally need some figurehead to sit at a reviewing stand and have flowers thrown at them. They literally need some figurehead to tell them what to do because they're not too bright. They have no future. That's why they need us. They need some kind of dictator, some kind of figurehead, some kind of person to tell them what to do because they're not smart enough to do it themselves. If you're wondering why folks like Hitler or some other tyrant can come to power and have the plebs back them, this is why. These folks are mentally ill and want a top-down, centrally planned life courtesy of Leviathan. They're scared and they think everyone should be subjected to the same constraints. I'm not fat and old like face bloat Stan Cedar, and I'm not old and unhealthy like old fart rants who sits around doing nothing for decades. And I asked Dave if he's still smoking cigarettes, but he wouldn't answer my question. So I don't know what the deal is. But I'm not fat and old like face bloat Stan Cedar, and I'm not unhealthy and sedentary like old fart rants who sit around complaining about folks who have businesses, private jets, and large bank accounts. I've hiked more miles in the last year than either of those two toads have in their entire lives. Even if they were 25 again, I would run circles around both of them, and that's a fact. There's no need to make me shelter in place. Social distancing in general practice, and I have been doing that for eons because social distancing is a great idea, especially for the elderly and those who are suffering from an immunodeficiency. And if social distancing itself works great, then the antique media can lay off Donald Trump or any other person they want to damage by autistically repeating death totals every day, screeching about people dying, and whining about beaches being open. It is possible to socially distance on a beach and more ventilation outside. So if those people who are autistically having little fits over the beach being open, but didn't condemn the protests. Hypocrisy. It is possible to socially distance on a beach, believe it or not, in a restaurant, a dental office, no offense, old fart rants, Walmart, in a house with a mouse, etc. Somehow, I think some progressives who will caterwaul endlessly about how social distancing works will also find some way to blame a political opponent for some bad COVID-19 news. But don't forget, social distancing works. Trump should have done more. Social distancing works. We need a national lockdown. Social distancing works. Sam Cedars' ex-wife increases social distancing guidelines between her and him from 6 feet to 6 miles. Social distancing works. Old Fart Ranch needs to violate social distancing guidelines between himself and a toothbrush. Social distancing works. That said, we've seen an absolute deluge of folks autistically proclaiming social distancing is working. It's working, and by golly, we'll repeat this a million times. They're akin to many of the rioters in urban areas by Democrats. They don't have a lot to do, so they fill up their free time being a social media vegetable. That said, let's look at some data that I've been following for some time, pitting the non-lockdown states, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Arkansas, versus the lockdown maniacs, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., and Rhode Island. Later, I expanded this to add Delaware and Maryland, but that was later. The former states never had a shelter-in-place order, and the latter had lockdowns of varying scope and length. Previous link didn't have data for the District of Columbia, and you can find that here and here. I linked to it. They were under a stay-at-home order from April 1st, 2020 to May 29th, which is mild compared to what was going on down in New Mexico. The rest of the group had some sort of stay-at-home shelter-in-place or lockdown order by March 28th, 2020. Reading the literature, and Vox's article on it was full of contradictions and ambiguity from those who are proclaiming social distancing works, and I'm not arguing with social distancing as a general guideline. Due to the number of folks who are asymptomatic, and some of the rise can be attributed to increased testing, which doesn't tell us much about what was happening prior to mass testing. We will also find out in the coming months, and remember I wrote this back in June, via antibody testing that a lot of folks had this and did not know it. Due to the number of folks who are asymptomatic and the number of days they have COVID-19 and did not know it. There's a 2-week lag from the day social distancing is implemented to the day we see results. So let's test that theory, and I'm not going to post the screenshots of all this. So Apple has published a lot of nifty and illuminating data on the movements of their patrons. Here's the data for all those states, lockdown or no lockdown, with the non-lockdowns first, and I archived all these over on my Facebook, and you can see from January 13th, which was the baseline, to about June 9th, how much people were driving, and if applicable, how much they were doing transit and walking. So this anybody with an Apple device, unless they started leaving it at home, that'd be a pretty good baseline, and I'll have some other data later. And then, so I did some some cities too as well. And in my video, COVID-19 and the end of federal mass transit subsidies, I updated it with a lot of those. And you can see how one thing we can see from this COVID-19 is people are avoiding transit like the plague. And there were a lot of progressives who were trying to defend transit. And I remember reading some of the peanut gallery comments. They'd start screeching about people taking a taxi, and then they'd start belly aching like banshees over people in an office. Like, you can't have 20 people in an office, and they're so retarded that they can't. Of course, these people probably don't work, so they don't know what it's like to actually be in a workplace and actually have to deal with other people. But yet somehow packing hundreds of people in a subway doesn't spread the virus, but 20 people in an office or a cab ride or going to the grocery store will spread it. So these people were out to lunch, and I did focus on one article where a couple of them made arguments like this, and I knocked all those arguments down. These people are crazy. And if you go look at those screenshots, you'll see what I'm about to say. As you can see, from the non-lockdown states listed first above, roughly mid-March, even sans lockdown, those states saw their folks basically shelter in place until roughly mid-April, give or take a few days. The trough in mid-April was roughly 60%, although some were less pronounced, such as Wyoming. The trough in mid-April was around 60%, so those folks stopped moving for roughly a month. even though their governors didn't think it was necessary for their residents to get cabin fever. And keep in mind, I wish I had data from last year to see how much driving actually does increase from like January to June. But if driving in June is like only 50% above the January 13th baseline, we can still say, well, people probably aren't driving as much. Because I'm assuming in Wyoming and pretty much anywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere, the driving markedly increases in June relative to January, but I don't know how much. So I will say it again, you need not make healthy young people shelter in place. If you have a young child with Hodgkin's or leukemia, that's a different story, and they should avoid as much human contact as possible. In fact, lock them up in the basement, never let them see anybody again so they can live. Because if you lock someone up in isolation for years so they don't get COVID, they'll be a lot better and they won't get depressed. I think you'll get that. Anybody with an IQ above room temperature will understand my facetious tone and what I mean there. It's apparent that after a month, the residents of those states decided that they had enough of basically doing nothing and resumed their lives again. And again, these are the states that didn't. Now, Iowa shut down restaurants and bars. And then when the bars were open, the 20-something idiots packed into the bars and started spreading COVID around. So then the progressives here were screeching and hollering about COVID cases are going up in Iowa because idiots are going to the bar. Yeah, well, they're idiots. That's why they're going to the bar, because they're idiots. It's apparent that after a month, the residents of those states decided that they had enough of basically doing nothing and resumed their lives again. Driving in those states resumed, and they were all, especially Wyoming, way above the January 13th baseline. Again, I'm not sure what normal is for April or May, but I presume folks in those states are moving about much, much more in April or May than in January, as the weather is usually nicer. It's not as if they weren't engaging in mitigation techniques. Now, this is where the progressives think everybody's so retarded that they need a spreadsheet vomited forth by Mr. Fauci to tell them what to do because they think everybody else is retarded like they are. It's not as if they weren't engaging in mitigation techniques. Many of them probably were probably wearing masks, even unnecessarily and for inordinate amounts of time, using hand sanitizer liberally, social distancing at work, working from home if they can, having their groceries delivered. Grocery stores had lines taped off on the floor, and they were letting old folks shop in the first hour of operation as a courtesy. Despite what Governor Andrew Cuomo or the obese Bill de Blasio may think, folks who live in rural areas are better prepared for this. We're not retarded, and we can take care of our own. Now, when a Democrat from Iowa says take care of our own, what they mean is taxpayers from 49 other states are going to pay for it. That's what they mean. Let's look at the 8 jurisdictions. Some of them went hog wild and are still seeing active stay-at-home orders. Again, this was written in June. Those 8 jurisdictions up in the Northeast are having the lion's share of the problems with COVID-19. As for those states, we can again see, even prior to most lockdown orders in March, folks stopped moving about in mid-March. But this was after de Blasio told the plebs and the idiots to go out on the town. They stopped moving in about mid-March. That's when the you-know-what hit the fan. What is different from the non-lockdown states is how pronounced the trough was. Now, this is where progressives are they're good people, and they do what the government says. All of them hit the negative 60% mark from the January 13th baseline, or got very, very close. And other consistent behaviors, despite a stay-at-home order, in mid-April, driving started moving up, although only 2 at the time were in plus 40% territory. Only 3 as of June 9th, 2020, were in single digits or still in minus territory. In those states, movement has picked up a lot, but still well below what would be considered normal. Transit, on the other hand, and this is another reason to sever all taxpayer dollars to it, transit, on the other hand, has seen its already declining use crater in the District of Columbia, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, San Diego, the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and the entire U.S. en masse. In New York City on March 15th, walking had a marked and definitive decline. That was reckoning day for the big road apple, and it was March 12th for transit. The same can be said of driving on the very same day. That was slightly prior to the lockdown order, and the same day de Blasio announced that New York City schools were closing. People, for the most part, are not moving around in New York City as of June 12, 2020, but it is picking up. Can you imagine those idiots have been locked down for about 3 months. So how many people aren't going to have jobs when it does decide to, when they decide to, let people live their life again? That's after Cuomo gets done shoving as many COVID patients in nursing homes and killing old people. When he's done with that and they can get back to their life again, how many people won't have the job that they had in mid-March? It's uncanny. On March 15th, long before the D.C. lockdown, our STD-laden, homicide-ridden nation's capital saw its driving decline markedly. And on March 12th for transit. Apple has, you can look at this on, Apple's also got a spreadsheet where you can look at this day by day and see how driving and walking and transit just went. Again, once you consider that by April, when the weather is nicer, folks probably do a lot more in a normal year. That said, we probably have not returned to normal quite yet, although many cities have crested the January 13th baseline. Chicago Transit, and I discussed this in my article on Bill Maher and COVID-19, many progressives were grinding their yellow teeth that transit was being blamed for spreading COVID-19. Apparently, many folks in progressive cities believe that because they are avoiding transit like the plague. Every single city I looked at in the U.S. has seen transit crater. So and a lot of them are Democrat-run cities with a lot of black-on-black homicide and a lot of crime and a lot of drug addicts. These people, these pious progressives, believe transit is something you want to avoid. So I don't know what they're doing now. I mean, a lot of them probably don't even have a car. And of course, if you don't have a job, you don't really need a car. And if you're having the government pay for everything and you live in public housing, you don't really need a car. The only thing, maybe you need a car to go get cigarettes, but other than that. So, driving was well above the January 13th baseline. Considering that, are these do-gooder progressives guilty of killing people? Are they guilty of murder for going out, for leaving their hovels and small apartments replete with prefabricated designs that would make a blind homosexual man screech in horror? People in New York State are driving a lot more in June than in April and May. Are they guilty of ignoring Governor Cuomo? Shall they be indicted for murder if anyone in New York dies from COVID-19 in the next 2 months? Just as elitist progressives in New York City ignore high cigarette prices by purchasing from the black market, they are not listening to Maher Cuomo. They should be staying at home, doing an old fart rants and Sam Cedar do, sitting alone in front of the computer in a small apartment. Residents of New Jersey apparently did not get the memo either. They were driving a lot more in late May, early June prior to the lockdown ceasing than in the 6 weeks prior. Indict them on murder charges because not sheltering in place. Someone might get COVID-19 and that's no good. Even the 2 weeks prior to George Floyd's apparent murder at the hands of police, folks in Washington State, now I know he wasn't killed in Washington State, but that's where some of the bleep show started. Even the 2 weeks prior to George Floyd's apparent murder at the hands of the police, folks in Washington State were driving a lot more than the January 13th baseline. Yet they had the stay home, stay healthy ordinance in effect. Don't they know der governor issued der order and they better abide by it? Guess not. But I presume, like Neil Ferguson, they would lecture us on how we should stay away from the beach and stay home because pandemic preys upon drug addicts, old folks, alcoholics, minorities, women, progressives, WASP, and toothless hippies living in California with multiple failed marriages. Delaware, as you saw, if you look that up, has seen their driving spike in the last month, and despite their lockdown being in effect till the end of May, their driving was increasing steadily in the weeks prior. Pious progressives ignoring der governor? That isn't right. Illinois saw their driving in the 15 days prior to the lockdown ending increase markedly, even though death was on their doorstep and the fate of mankind was at stake. I guess living life was more important. Eh? Residents of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut did a good job obeying their orders, but driving, and thus that thing that's called life, has been picking up lately. Again, remember I wrote this in mid-June. Residents of California en masse Los Angeles and the Bay Area continue to be dutifully obedient of Miss Newsom, although it did pick up on June 12, 2020. I would presume it was mostly because of George Floyd protests. No protest scheduled for the thousands of young black men executed by other young black men in alleys across decaying Democrat cities. Then I got some other data for Jacksonville, Florida is returning to normal, but Miami not so much. The last 2 weeks before Michigan's lockdown ended, they were driving a lot more than they were in April. Guess they didn't get the memo, and neither did Detroit. Texas, and you can look at this by city too, Apple's data. They got tons of data if you want. Texas significantly reduced its driving in the weeks prior to the lockdown, and it remained well below the baseline until a week or so after the lockdown ended, as did Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. People in Texas had it figured out already and were scared enough to do less moving around before and after the lockdown. What I've seen in every jurisdiction that I looked at, transit has seen a massive decline. The American people apparently are skeptical of using transit in cities that have effectively taken/subsidized folks out of their cars are in a pickle. And New York City, that's one of their major problems. New York City said, hey, you know what? Let's create a culture where we get people out of the car and stick them in the subway, which is a great idea until you have a pandemic. Of course, with enough people leaving New York City now, maybe you guys will have enough room for more people, because I hear a lot of productive people are leaving, which means Stan Cedar will continue to live there because he's a social media vegetable, and I doubt he could afford to move anywhere else. That's not the case in most places. I'm talking of jurisdictions that push people out of their car. But good luck anyways, New York City, much of New Jersey and other areas of the Northeast. There's a lot of data there you can sift through if you'd like. And I'm not going to go over what I covered on the UK and Italy. You can read that for yourself. Now let's shift to another set of data courtesy of the University of Maryland. Let's pit the non-lockdowns, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Nebraska, Arkansas, versus the COVID-19 laden lockdown brigade, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., Rhode Island. Again, now I do need to mention that I've done this to a lot of progressives, and they get mad, and they start screeching, population density, it's so dense there. Well, as I mentioned earlier, whose fault is that? Packing them in like sardines and saying, well, let's get them out of their car and put them on the subway. That's your fault. That's why I also calculate a death rate. Like, for example, if I told you guys, California's got the most homicides of any state in the U.S., it must be the most dangerous place in the U.S. No retards. You calculate a homicide rate. That's why when I calculate a death rate, you can see that those states up in the Northeast have rates many, many, many times greater than the states that didn't lock down. So, screeching population density just means you didn't take a statistics class. And to counter that, and you can look at the data for yourself, I'm not going to read it off, I took 8 very densely populated jurisdictions outside the Northeast. 3 in Texas, 3 in California, Cook County, Illinois, and DeKalb County, Georgia. The 3 in California are Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Orange County. And the 3 in Texas are Harris, Dallas, and Tarrant counties. And I calculated their death rates, and they've been lately slightly below the national average, so that debunks your population density argument. Although I'm sure progressives will utilize moving goalposts and anything with a population density less than New York City, which San Francisco is pretty close. They'll say, oh, it's not dense enough. Once you hit a certain point, well, then maybe you need to end your smart growth policies that pack them in like sardines. We won't let a city get any more dense than a certain level, and then you got to start moving people out. So that objection was easily refuted. So let's compare those states. Here's what I did. I took the nationwide statistics for social distancing index on each day from the University of Maryland. You can go to that website and look at it. I took the social distancing index number from each day. And then I calculated an average for what that was, and then a population standard deviation. Then I looked at each one of those states and got their average for a month. So for all of February, I took the nationwide stats for social distancing index on each day, and that averaged, this is February. Now remember, this is before the you-know-what really hit the fan. That's an average of 21.448 and a population standard deviation of 9.95. And for February, the lockdown brigade, that's New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, D.C., Massachusetts, had a collective average of 24.166, which is within one standard deviation of the mean. And the non-lockdown states, that's Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Utah, they had an average of 21.571, much lower than the lockdown brigade, but still above the average and within one standard deviation. So they're, and if you want to read, the University of Maryland's got all this data, how they calculated this. For all of March, nationwide, the average social distancing index was 35.774 with a standard deviation of 18.113. Now the lockdown brigades, their average in March was 42.666, well above the average but still within one standard deviation. So the social distancing index spiked markedly for March, but the lockdown brigade was still within one standard deviation. And the non-lockdown brigade, again, that's Iowa and those other states, had an average in March of 30.285. That's within one standard deviation of the mean. You can see the standard deviation was massive. It was well below the national average, and the lockdown brigade was well above, but it's still with one standard deviation, so the difference really isn't too huge. However, for April, nationwide, the average was 53.666, standard deviation of 7.9. For April, New York and the other lockdown states had an average of 65.3, well above one standard deviation from the mean. So those folks in those states are super duper social distancers. If I lived in New York, I would avoid people too, as much as Sam Cedars' ex-wife avoids him. For Iowa and those other states that didn't lock down, their average in April was 40.857, which is more than one standard deviation below the average. Those folks are naughty. So Iowa should be a veritable cemetery then, and so should those other states. Their death rate should be willy high. For May, the nationwide, and again, I wrote all this down, so you can go read it for yourself. For all of May, the nationwide average social distancing index was 39 with a standard deviation of 8.257. And you can see that nationally, America was saying, no, we've had enough of lockdowns. We're not going to do it anymore, because April was much higher in March, but in May it went way down. So we're not listening to our leaders. We're not listening to Fauci, and Fauci's. We need to do what he says, and if you don't listen to Fauci, you're stupid. The average in May was 39, standard deviation 8.257. In May, New York and the other lockdown states had a mean of 51, so they're way above the one standard deviation barrier. They should be doing really well, shouldn't they? And in May, Iowa and those other states that are naughty and didn't lock down had an average of 26.714. That's below one standard deviation below the average, which means those states are not doing their civic duty. There ought to be piles of dead bodies all over the place, right? And then from June 1st to June 12th, I'll cut this short. New York, New Jersey, the lockdown states, had an average of that was more than one standard deviation above the average nationally. And from June 1st to June 12th, Iowa and those other states were still naughty. Their standard deviation was, their average social distancing index was more than one standard deviation below the average. So Iowa and those other states should be veritable graveyards, and New York and those other states should be doing really good. But the problem is, and if you go through the data that I've covered, and I've been pretty much covering this a couple times. I'm trying to do it once a week. And here's the last time I checked this. The last time I uploaded on, it's been a while, September 11th. The lockdowns New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., Rhode Island had a death rate of 157.626. Now, I haven't done this looked at the social distancing index for all of June, the rest of June, July, and August, September, so I don't know where it went. I would assume those states are doing really good if you look at just that. And you'd find out that, is this University of Maryland data? Is it garbage in, garbage out? Are they using this to, what do they want? What are they trying to do with this data? Is this going to prove that lockdowns work? Because if lockdowns really work, then those states up in the Northeast should be doing a lot better. But New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., Rhode Island, death rate of 157.626. The lockdowns +2, it's all those states, and adding Delaware and Maryland, death rate of 143.714. Again, this is from September 11th. I'll update this again soon. The non-lockdowns had a death rate of 24.775. So that is many times the pile of dead bodies up in the progressive Northeast is a lot larger. So that's kind of makes you think maybe lockdowns don't work. Maybe packing people in like sardines and shoving everybody in small apartments. I don't know, maybe Stan Cedar likes being alone away from his ex-wife in a small apartment. I mean, if he does, because from what I hear, she doesn't want to be around him, but maybe he enjoys that. But I like having a big yard and stuff. Those densely populated counties outside the progressive Northeast, they had a death rate on September 11th of 56.919, which was actually slightly below the U.S. average of 57.23. So I just wanted to get that data out there. Some people may not find it interesting. They might find it boring. But the University of Maryland data dictates to me either it's garbage in, garbage out data, because as of June 9th, those states up in the Northeast were way, way ahead as far as death rates from the states that did not lock down. In fact, as of on June 15th, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., and Rhode Island had a death rate of 139.366 on June 15th. And then if you add Maryland and Delaware, the death rate was 125.969 on June 15th. So, yeah, it doesn't look like... and the states that didn't lock down, those states with Republican governors that hate people and want people to die, as of June 15th, those states only had a death rate of 10.082. So either the University of Maryland data is garbage in, garbage out, or lockdowns don't really work. Maybe people in Iowa are just better. Maybe Iowa's just got a better culture, and I think it probably does. We don't have as many drug addicts and fatherless children running around wrecking stuff and setting buildings on fire. I mean, there are some idiots here. I mean, look at all the votes that Fred Hubble got in the last election. We do have plenty of idiots, but most of them are at least half civilized. So I'd have to say just those states just have a better culture. And those people are more civilized. And I think if you look at the number of fatherless children running around and then up in the Northeast, if you just take a look at the culture, I think that explains much of it. So, yeah, if social distancing really worked that great, I mean, if the lockdowns worked that great, you would see, you wouldn't see a huge disparity between the Northeast and those states that didn't lock down. But progressives, I don't think they're not logical. They're not rational. You can't have a conversation with somebody who thinks that me going to the beach or on a hike is going to cause grandma to die. So, yeah. It's like with the Imperial College model where they said, we're going to have 2 million, 1.5 to 2.2 million deaths because they thought everybody was so stupid that nobody would use hand sanitizer or wear a mask or socially distance. I've been socially distancing for eons because people. So hopefully you find that information interesting. If you don't, that's fine. I don't care. But pass it on. Go read it and pass it on. Have a nice day and don't thank me now.